So we had the bell ringer. What did you learn about the war in Afghanistan? That's what we covered yesterday. The first thing here is make sure you complete and submit the US2 timeline. That's where you went to the 9/11 memorials timeline and looked at the different artifacts and videos, some posters, some other things. And you just had to submit 10 facts and 5 interpretations for that. So please make sure you submit that today if you haven't already. Then the reading, of course, went with that terrorism selection. Please make sure that you submit that. That was from the beginning of the week. And then the 9/11 assignment, which went along with those videos that we watched in class. If you weren't here, of course, the links to the videos are on that assignment page. And so just take the time at the beginning of class to make sure that you've completed and submitted all these things. Then we'll take the notes on the war on terror about in the middle of class. That should say actually Iraq and not Afghanistan. And then we will submit the notes after that because that will finish the notes for us. And then if you haven't already, take the quizzes. So if you're done with all these things at the top already, you can go ahead and take the quizzes, for instance. And then the only new thing for today would be the third journal. You just simply have to answer what did you learn about the best in this unit and what could you learn more about. So just make sure you follow the directions for the number of sentences and make sure you proofread it. And then one thing I don't have up here is that slideshow that you should put together. That isn't due until next week, and you'll have time to work on that next week as well. Does anybody have any questions? Remember, you can take the quiz twice. The quizzes you can take twice, and it will take your highest score. So if nobody has any questions at this time, go ahead and go through this list here and make sure that they're all complete. I'll leave this up here instead of the timer. And then once 25 minutes is over, we'll take the notes on the war in Iraq. I'm going to change that right now because that will bother me. So the last of the notes, we will look at the war in Iraq. Three things: background and reasoning behind the war itself, and the long-term results. So let's first look at background and reasoning. And so where we left off with the last time was Saddam. He had lost the Gulf War and he was weakened. So he was in a weak position. Saddam, we'll just call him by his first name since he's an old friend, Saddam. And Saddam, because he was weakened, he needs to do something to look and feel tough. So he concentrated on suppressing the non-Sunni people. He concentrated on suppressing the non-Sunni people.
What was his name again?
Saddam, Saddam. He was Sunni, so he wanted to basically discriminate against all the people that weren't, including the Shia Muslims, which made up a majority. So because he was weakened, he concentrated on suppressing the non-Sunnis. And also to look tough, he leaked false information that he was developing weapons of mass destruction. He leaked false information that he was developing weapons of mass destruction. Now, they did have some equipment and supplies, but they never really got to the stage that he indicated. So he leaked false information that he was developing weapons of mass destruction. He also started using more religious rhetoric. He used more religious rhetoric. Rhetoric is spelled R-H-E-T-O-R-I-C. It's R-H-E-T-O-R-I-C. So rhetoric. Speech that has some kind of purpose to it, but maybe not that specific or detailed. In this case, he was just trying to use broad, sweeping religious language to make people think that he was. And during this time, he himself did not actively pursue terrorists. He did not actively pursue terrorists. It is possible there were some terrorists hiding in Iraq at the time. So he did not actively pursue terrorists. All of this together, of course, was bad for him because it made some people look like he was maybe becoming close to the religious terrorists, like Al Qaeda, for instance. It made him look like he might give them some kind of dangerous weapons, or he might use them himself because he was spreading these false rumors. And so because of all this information, the United States and others believed that he was a danger to the world. So the United States actually went to the UN, the United Nations, said, we would like to form an alliance to remove Saddam Hussein. But the United Nations didn't agree with all of the evidence, and so they declined. So it was the United States and a coalition of a much smaller number of countries than what happened back in the 90s. So less countries involved. So the next item up there, number 2, is the actual war. And a lot of people think this is at the same time as Afghanistan, but it was actually just a little bit after. The war began on March 2003, and basically the same way. Large amount of airstrikes followed by troops. March of 2003. By April, Saddam's government crumbled. By April, Saddam's government crumbled. So it did not last long. In May, President Bush declared mission accomplished. In May, President Bush declared mission accomplished. It was a big photo op. When he was younger, he used to be in Air National Guard, so he even flew in on a plane. There was another pilot there. Landed on an aircraft carrier, and there's a big banner that said mission accomplished. So it was a big deal. I'm sure he felt very proud that day. Mission accomplished. About the same time, we decided to disband or dismiss the Iraqi army. Now you might think, well, that makes sense. They were the enemy. They should be gotten rid of. Well, unfortunately, Iraq still needed an army in case any type of problems happened. And we got rid of some of their most experienced soldiers. And not all of them were necessarily loyal to Saddam. And so that created a problem that would haunt us a little bit later on. Because by June, an organized resistance began. By June, an organized resistance began. And some of this resistance, of course, is going to use terrorism. And that's exactly what happened in August of that year. The UN headquarters in Iraq was destroyed by a terrorist. And by December of that year, we finally captured Saddam, who had been in hiding. Finally captured Saddam, who had been in hiding. In this picture in the top right-hand corner is Saddam. After he's been captured, we get him cleaned up and give him a suit to wear. He's grown a nice beard at that point. The picture of the statues with the flags on them was part of the issue, because for us it looked like we were liberating Iraq, but to some of the Iraqi people it looked like we were invading. And so this is the same statue of Saddam Hussein. When the troops first got there, they did like troops usually do. You raise the flag, so they put an American flag. And then their officers reminded them, no, we can't do that because it's going to look like we're taking over the country. So then they took that down and put the Iraqi flag instead. So that was the big problem, is it was a misconception about, what we were there for. We were there to invade, or we were there to liberate. So that brings us to the last item, the long term. There was major resistance in Fallujah. Major resistance in Fallujah. And Fallujah is spelled Fallujah. That's Fallujah. And that's a major city in Iraq in the south. And a lot of street fighting. And this wasn't just resistance as in terrorists, individuals blowing up stuff. It was actual people that were militants, kind of like the military, but they were still civilian, that were organizing a resistance. And they were mostly Shia. And this was a sign of problems that were going to happen later on. But in the midst of this violence, in 2005, the Iraqis elected or voted in a new constitution. So in 2005, the Iraqis voted in a new constitution. Much of the fighting is going to happen between the Shia, Shia. Much of the fighting is going to happen between the Shia and the Sunnis, Sunnis. The Shia and the Sunnis. And remember, there's a religious difference. The Sunnis believe that Muhammad didn't appoint someone. The Shias believe that Muhammad did appoint someone. But they weren't fighting, firing back and forth at each other with guns, yelling about Muhammad and who he appointed. It was really just after all these centuries, they just knew we are this group and we hate this other group. There's really, if you sat down and asked them for an explanation, they would yell about how the other side are heretics and they're blasphemous, but you probably couldn't get any real details out of them because the hate was just built in so much at this point. And only a dictator like Saddam Hussein could keep them in line. So now that dictator is gone, these tensions erupted. The Shias were being supported by Iran. So the Shias were being supported by Iran, which is right next door. By 2006, Saddam had been tried and executed. So under the new constitution, the Iraqi court system decided to prosecute him for his crimes when he was suppressing other people, sometimes even using chemicals and poisons on some of his own citizens. And so he was tried and executed for those crimes. It was a good old-fashioned hanging. By 2007, a surge, S-U-R-G-E, a surge of troops was sent from the United States to stop the violence. So we actually had been decreasing the numbers of troops, and now we sent a surge, a large number of them over to help stop the violence in 2007. But over the next couple of years, people were getting leery because this war had now dragged on from 2003 to 2007, and then it went longer than World War II, and then 5, and then 6 years. And so by 2009, the American people, it was strongly indicated when they went to vote the year before that they wanted the troops to be withdrawn. And so one of the first things President Obama did in 2009 is he decreased the number of troops. And by this point, Al Qaeda had been heavily ruined elsewhere. And whenever we see one terrorist organization that is destroyed or mostly destroyed, another one comes up out of the woodwork. And so that's exactly what happened. A new branch of Al Qaeda formed called ISIS. Capital I, capital S, capital I, capital S. So a new branch of Al Qaeda called ISIS would take over parts of Syria and northern Iraq. The United States, the Kurds, Kurds, the United States, the Kurds, and Syrian rebels helped push ISIS out. So this happened underneath President Trump. The United States coordinated efforts with the Kurdish people in the north who did most of the fighting, and then also some of the Syrian rebel groups in order to defeat ISIS. Now, some people say ISIS was destroyed, but that's actually not true. They were destroyed there in Syria and northern Iraq, but they still exist in a number of other countries in the region today. So ISIS still exists. And of course, now we have to be concerned that something will happen like before. Al Qaeda was decimated and ISIS grew out of it. So now some people worried the same thing will happen. A new organization will grow out of ISIS. But otherwise, Iraq has somewhat stabilized. It's still somewhat divided, and basically each of those groups, the Sunnis, the Shia, and the Kurds, kind of run their own part of the country. There is a parliament and a president of the entirety of Iraq, and they still have to worry about things like terrorism and things like that, but it isn't nearly as dangerous as it was before. But the question is, like Afghanistan, if we withdraw all of our troops, will they be okay on their own? And unfortunately, in both those countries, if things do go south and terrorists do take back over, the Taliban in Afghanistan, or maybe ISIS comes back in Iraq, then we'll have to go back and deal with it again. So that is one of the problems. How long do we keep troops there? Do we keep them there for another year, 10 years, 50 years? After all, we still do have troops in Germany and Japan, and World War II has been over for 70 years. So for the remainder of class, make sure that you take the quizzes. Make sure you submit the notes since we're done with those now. And make sure you take those quizzes at least once. You can take them twice. And then the last journal basically asks what you've learned the best and what could you learn more about. And you can use your quiz score to help determine that after you take them at least one time. Does anybody have any questions?